morning. Hello again. My name is Sarah Sewell. I'm a professor of history at Virginia Wesleyan University, and I'm happy to welcome you to this final presentation in a four-part series, which I have entitled The Cult of Domesticity. I sure hope everybody is doing well. I think it is Wednesday, April 22nd, and yeah, I'm glad to be with you again today. Next slide. So today's topic is the rebels. We're going to look at women who resisted this cult of domesticity. As I said, it is the final presentation. We're going to begin with a bit of a review to catch people up to speed in case they missed some or just need a little refresher. And then I'll go into the rebels. As always, if you have any questions or comments, I am happy to hear from you via email. My email address is SSEWELL Sarah Sewell at vwu.edu. So yeah, I'm happy to hear from you. So let's start with a bit of a review. Next slide. So I've read this quotation to you. I think it sort of sums up how many Europeans looked at women and women's rights throughout most of the 19th century. It is from a jurist, a lawyer during the Napoleonic era in the beginning of the 19th century. And here's what he had to say. There have been many discussions on the equality and superiority of the sexes. Nothing is more useless than such disputes. Women need protection because they are weaker. Men are free because they are stronger. Now, we might laugh at that, raise an eyebrow or two, but I think that's how most people in the Western world thought in the 19th century. Women biologically had different functions, and they were weaker, and they needed protection, and therefore, they should be limited in their work in the public sphere. Men, by contrast, were stronger. They believed that they were smarter, and therefore they should be public actors. Next slide. So a lot of Europeans, particularly if you were from the middle classes and could afford to, pursue this cult of domesticity. And one thing to help it along was Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 to 1901, very many years. She became an iconic figure in the 19th century. That's what we refer to as the Victorian era. And she had many qualities that people perceived in the public. She was a fine ruler, but in addition to that, she was an exemplary mother and wife with 9 children. Next slide. So if you found the person of your dreams, someone who was a suitable match, of course, for you socially, then it culminated in a marriage. And the woman, often kind of young, went with the man to the new home. Next slide. In the new home, the mother and wife was charged with creating a domestic atmosphere that facilitated happiness. And this drawing here really sums it up. You have the woman there. She looks like she's doing some needle points or sewing. You have her husband in the background reading the newspaper in peace and quiet. Children in the front playing, and then 2 older children, women, girls, playing the piano and probably singing in the background. So that's what the families look like. The mother was in charge of creating this domestic harmony. But I think what's also interesting about this drawing is the fact that there are many objects in the drawing, in the living room, the parlor, filled with chandeliers and draperies and paintings and sculptures, a clock, furniture. And so the woman of the household, her charge was to decorate, to go procure these items for their family. Next slide. So after one got married, then the ideal was to have children. So in addition to a cult of domesticity, there's a new emphasis on childhood and motherhood in the 19th century. And it's different than it had been previously in the West. I think this Elizabeth Grindson quotation sort of sums it up. There is no love so forcible as the love of an affectionate mother to her natural child. And so motherhood becomes idealized. And if you think about it, in the 19th century, we do see infant mortality rates decreasing. Prior to that, children died frequently, and of course, women died frequently also in childbirth. And because, a child might die upon birth, or, it was really difficult to reach the age of 5. A lot of families, parents didn't sort of, invest a lot of emotion into those children. But now that children were living longer and the infant mortality rate dropped, and there's this emphasis on a cult of domesticity, part of that is taking care of the children and becoming the ideal mother, modeling, of course, Queen Victoria. Next slide. And so all of a sudden, in addition to this cult of domesticity, we have what I would call the invention of childhood. Previously, if a child was working, was in a peasant family, they worked on the farm, they were seen as little adults contributing to the family economy. Now in the 19th century, Europeans and Americans begin to sort of segment this part of a person's life as childhood, and they begin to think, hey, maybe they should be doing something different. Maybe they should not be working. Well, if they're not working, what would they do? Well, number one, they might play. And that's what this ad here, can you put the slide on? This ad here shows you, this is for this is some kind of ointment for rheumatism, but what they are doing is they're showing children playing. They're putting the ointment on the horse's leg because the leg is creaking. But you can see these children are dressed in childlike clothing, playing together with a toy. So one of the things that they wanted to do was segment off this part of someone's existence and call it childhood. The children play, but in addition to that, in the course of the 19th century, Western countries and Japan will also institute compulsory public education. And so children were to be educated as well. Next slide. So when we talk about industrialization, the first round of industrialization, end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, in places like the United States and Britain, we focus on number one, cotton, and then heavy industry, things like railroads and iron ore and coal. By the end of the 19th century, in the Western world, we have a second industrial revolution, and with that came new products, and one of them is consumers' goods. And so here you see a Santa Claus driving his car, and it's filled with all kinds of goods. And so these are for little children. Christmas becomes a child's holiday. So this is part of this, the children are different, and we need to do things differently culturally to honor this. Next slide. So last week, what we talked a lot about was women's fashions. And so one of my arguments is that in this cult of domesticity, they wanted to fashion the female body to mirror their sensibility about motherhood. And that meant having an hourglass figure, very pinched, tiny waist, and then lots of emphasis put on the breast line. The breasts with the corset are pushed up, and then you can see, as in this these pictures here, they're very much decorated, and then the hips are also emphasized. So this is the mid-19th century fashion. This is Scarlett O'Hara kind of stuff. This is the crinoline. So this is just sort of one version of an hourglass figure. Next slide. And by the turn of the 20th century, the sort of iconic figure is the Gibson Girl. And here you see the most famous of them all, Camilla Clifford, who has this body that is the ideal of femininity at the end of the 19th and 20th centuries. Next slide. So in order to get that shape, you needed a corset. And there's different versions of corsets depending on the fashion in the 19th and the early 20th century. This English magazine called English Women's Domestic Magazine sort of summed up why I have a corset. Everyone must admit that a slender waist is a great acquisition. The so-called evil of tight lacing is so much cant. To me, the sensation is superb, and I am never prouder than when I survey the fascinating undulations that art affords to nature. So with the corset, what you have is what they call tight lacing. So you can see this in the back of the woman with the corset, where you have straps or fabric, and then you just tighten and tighten and tighten to get the waist as tiny as possible. women definitely aimed for a waist measurement of less than 20 inches. Some attain it based on sort of history and sort of documentation of clothing. We know that the average was like 20 to 23 inches, which is still small. But lots of emphasis placed on tiny waists. Next slide. And in the Cult of Domesticity, the mother was charged with training their daughters to to wear these fashions. And so here you see a mother, and she's showing, this is an advertisement for Marshall Fields for the girls' corsets, and the mother has a mirror there, and she's showing the little girl how fabulous she looks in this training corset. Girls as young as 6 and 7 years old began to have their body put into a corset in order to train it. And the idea is, if you keep putting the corset on and tightening the laces in the back, you could reshape the body so the waist would be very tiny, and then the girl, when she became an adult, would have a waist of around 20 inches or so. Next slide. And so this is where I stopped last time. This is a cartoon, but it just shows you, gives you just a little bit of insight into this sort of extreme waist tightening that was popular in the 19th century. I think I might have mentioned to you, a girl's ambition was to not have a waist measurement larger than the age she was when she was married. So she married at 21, she wanted to have a 21-inch waist. Next slide. Tightening your waist with corsets and tight lacing cause physical deformities. Here you can see an illustration of body disfigurement as a result of these tight corsets. Next slide. And here you see another illustration. Definitely there were medical problems that resulted from the corset and the tight lacing, including the rib cage being deformed, abdominal muscles would be weakened, sometimes they would have respiratory ailments, and then you would even have displacements of organs, including reproductive organs, which is the irony, right? On the one hand, they want women to have children, but on the other hand, they're having them wear these corsets, which are causing some problems in their internal organs and actually increasing risks of miscarriage and even maternal death. Ladies' Treasury described it this way: if she has not full command of her respiration, how can she move about in that enchanting way, which is natural with girls when they leave nature to herself? So I love this quotation because it just sort of shows how complex all this is. On the one hand, it's arguing that wearing a corset basically, causes problems for women. She cannot breathe. And then on the other hand, it's saying, well, and then they can't be the kind of feminine ideal that we want. They can't sort of move around gracefully and lightly because they are strapped in with a corset. Next slide. This is from Francis Power Cobb, The Treasury of Literature. Here's what he had to say. Can anything be in worse taste than to wear clothes by which our natural movements are impeded and our purposes thwarted by our own habiliments? It is, in the strictest sense, barbaric, like a Chinese woman's foot, to load ourselves with long trailing skirts when we wish to take a brisk walk or to run up and down stairs, to wear bonnets which give no shade to the eyes under a summer sun, and need to be supplemented by the imperfect aid of a parasol, is another fallacy of taste. Worst of all, an evil for which no words can be found strong enough, is the evil of women's stays or corsets. Why American and European women are tormented by these abominable machines, which the lithesome women of the East have never borne, it is hard to imagine. So here you see a firm critique, not only of corsets and clothing that deforms the body, but also all the fashions accessories that needed to go with it, bonnets and parasols and whatnot. And so, one of the things I like about Frances's quote here is she likens the corset to the wrapping of feet in China, which was common at that time. And probably a lot of Westerners would look at these Chinese feet and say, this is horrible. How can you deform the feet? We know that Chinese women could have feet that were crushed, and so they would be only like 4 inches long. And one of the things, one of the problems with a 4-inch foot is you can't walk, so you can't run away if you're need to. And so while the West might be outraged at this idea that the Chinese would crush their women's feet to 4 inches, this using of the corset was a similar phenomena. Next slide. This is a slide of Christian Dior's Tulip line from 1953. So I'm jumping way ahead. You might know that after the turn of the 20th century, the corset began to go away, particularly when women began to work during World War I. And then in the 1920s, the flapper sort of outfit was all the rage. They didn't wear corsets. However, we know that to look like they wanted to in the flapper outfits, you had to be extremely thin. So there was sort of problems with women basically starving themselves to death. Then you get to the 30s and the 40s, and you got the war again, and fashions began to loosen. But after you get past World War II, this hourglass figure, corseted girdle, comes back. And I put this up here because I'm thinking that there are some women in the audience today who wore clothes similar to this in the 1950s. And so, some food for thought about, what we wore and what we wear now, and what that means in terms of feminine identity. Okay, next question. Or next slide, excuse me. So I never want to leave the guys behind. And I absolutely love this quotation from Stefan Zweig in his autobiography called The World of Yesterday. He was an Austrian writer in the 20th century, and he's describing his father here. When I try to recall to mind the figures of grown-ups who stood about my childhood, I am struck with the fact that many of them were corpulent at an early age. My father, my uncle, my teacher, the salesman in the shops, the members of the Philharmonic at their music stands were already at 40 years old, portly and worthy men. They walked slowly, they spoke with measured accent, and in their conversation stroked their well-kept beards, which often had already turned gray. But gray hair was merely a new sign of dignity, and a sedate man consciously avoided the gestures and high spirits of youth as being unseemly. A really different world. He's describing the world at the end of the 19th century when men wanted to be respected. And in order to become a business leader, in order to like receive a loan from a bank, you had to show that you were serious and you had maturity. And so men actually cultivated an image that made them look older than they necessarily had to. And part of that was also having kind of some weight on you. But what's interesting, next slide, is when all this corset craze really hits its height at the end of the 19th century with women, they begin to sort of look at men's bodies too. Okay, and here you can see a girdle type advertisement in French for a man's girdle. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, but at the end of the 19th century, we have the birth of the modern sporting movement. And with that comes an entirely different notion of bodies, and men then are to be in shape in a way that we think of today. But prior to that, a man would not be in shape. He would carry extra weight because that showed he was middle class, he could eat, and he was older, and so he was a secure bet in terms of a job or a loan. Next slide. So women, already, I talked about them going to different stores and the new department stores and buying lots of goods for their homes. Well, they also had to buy the clothing. And so keeping up with the Joneses in terms of fashion meant that women had to do a lot of a lot of shopping. And if you look at these styles, it's not just the dress, it's not just the corset and all the undergarments that go with it. To have the look, you also had to buy lots and lots of accessories. And you have the birth of the modern fashion industry. And part of what we know about the fashion industry is they got to keep inventing styles to keep consumers buying goods. And so women, particularly if they're from the middle classes and have the money, they buy a lot of clothing, the second part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So one of the things they're involved in is what we call conspicuous consumption. They're buying goods that they wear to show that they belong to a certain class. And so shopping in and of itself became a cultural ritual with all kinds of rules and etiquettes. So in addition to going into the store or going to a dressmaker, you also gathered with other women. It was important to be seen, but this was also a time when you could socialize with other women as they shopped as well. Certainly men of the middle class wanted their wives shopping, because by shopping and buying the goods and being seen shopping, then men could have their social status reinforced. So wives were kind of like a status symbol for men, in that by shopping and then wearing the clothing, the men looked like they were taking care of their wives in a good way. Next slide. The dressing was very complex. There's no simplicity of dressing at all. You need clothing for different kinds of events. You need clothing if you're going out. You need clothing if you're going to a ball. You need clothing for the home. You need clothing for different seasons. So there's lots and lots and lots of outfits. And women often change clothing during the day. And this was sort of, again, highly ritualistic. But in addition to the dress, you needed all of the accessories. You needed proper hats, gloves, shoes, purses, ribbons, and lace. And so here you see an advertisement for women's hats. Next slide. This is an advertisement then for winter coats. So you had to have the proper winter coat to go with the outfit. And then you can also see they got hats on and some kind of scarf bow around their neck. Next slide. You had to have the proper shoes. At the Victorian era, they like to wear these boots, and here you can see an advertisement for the London Shoe Company's boots. Next slide. And here's an advertisement for all kinds of accessories, and you can just see there's this, it's not as simple as buying a dress. So it's very ritualistic. You have to buy everything that goes with it. And then can you imagine the time that it takes to put on all this stuff? And, you know, a lot of it is very restrictive stuff. So now you have to go out and like exist in all of these clothing. Next slide. So women of means, they often went to, to places that made custom clothing, and that's what you see here in a German magazine. So you could get custom-made dresses, custom-made hats, and whatnot. But most women went to department stores. Next slide. So I showed you, I think, this picture before from the most famous of the French stores, Le Bon Marché in Paris, that was founded around 1850 and really became sort of an iconic department store in France in the course of the 19th century. And so, you know, the store itself is lovely, and it has all of the goods together with fixed prices. And so women can go in there and understand what it is that they can purchase and how much it costs and how long it takes, and they get a lot of service. So most women are buying their clothes in department stores because the clothes are being made through the Industrial Revolution, so they're being produced in a factory. Next slide. And what does that mean? Well, women have entered what we call the public sphere in a very important way by the end of the 19th century. Next slide. And so here you see an advertisement for Swan and Edgar's department store in London with a lot of different things, accessories for the woman. And one of the things, well, a few things to note here. First of all, advertising is taking off. We think of the modern advertising industry born at the end of the 19th century. So the advertising becomes very sophisticated, and it's trying to encourage women to spend even more money. In addition to the advertising, there is a very healthy fashion press, just like there is there advice guides for like how to run a household, how to take care of a child, how to get married, how to court, so on and so forth. There is also a press for how to dress. Very interesting, in a lot of these magazines, they would also publish patterns. And so if you couldn't make it to the city to buy the clothing, or if you didn't have the money to buy the clothing, you could get the pattern and sew the fashions from at home as well. And if you recall, a couple of times ago, we talked about the sewing machine. So the sewing machine in the course of the 19th century was completely reimagined. The beginning of the 19th century, the sewing machine was a tool, it was a machine, and the belief was that only men should operate machines. By the end of the 19th century, particularly with producers like Singer, they refashioned the magazine into something that a woman should use as a machine for women to use. And now you have these sewing patterns, and so women can sew their own clothing. Next slide. So Leo Tolstoy, you might know him. He was a Russian author. In his The Kreutzer Sonata, he had this to say about women and their fashions and their shopping. Look at young ladies from the very highest society. The same clothes, the same styles, the same perfumes, the same bare arms, shoulders and bosoms, the same exaggerated behinds, the same passion for precious stones and expensive glittering ornaments, the same amusements, dancing, music, and singing. All the same means of enticing men are used by one as by the other. No difference at all. To make a strict distinction between them, we can only say that short-term prostitutes are usually despised, whereas long-term prostitutes are respected. So here he's criticizing this fashion obsession and arguing actually that by buying all these goods and wearing all these clothing, women just become the same. They all look the same. And then he, hammers it home in the final line saying, hey, a lot of these women are getting these clothing and all these fashions because they have a man who is taking care of them, and they are long-term prostitutes or mistresses of these men. So here is Tolstoy very critical of this fashion industry and women's buying of the fashions. Next slide. And so the cult of domesticity, in my view, culminates in this image here. This is an advertisement for absence. And, I just, like this woman here, for me, she is just the epitome of the cult of domesticity in this fashion. And what she looks like to me is a doll. She just looks like a woman who has been dressed up like a doll. And the clothing on her makes me feel like it's really constraining her. And Heinrich Ibsen, you might know his play A Doll's House from 1879. He sort of wrote about this. So the play is actually called A Doll's House, and the main character, the wife, Nora, she's trying to sort of do this cult of domesticity, and she comes to the realization that that is not her true calling, and she tells her husband this. Her husband is called Torvald, if you haven't read the play. So here's what Nora had to say. When I was at home with Papa, he told me his opinion about everything, and so I had the same opinions. And if I differed from him, I concealed the fact because he would not have liked it. He called me his doll child, and he'd play with me just as I used to play with my dolls. Our home, and now she's talking to her husband, our home has been nothing but a playroom. I have been your doll wife, just as at home I was Papa's doll child. And here the children have been my dolls. I thought it great fun when you played with me, just as they thought it great fun when I played with them. That is what our marriage has been, Torvald. So clearly Ibsen is indicting this cult of domesticity. And in fact, in this play, Nora ends up leaving her husband and her children, which is very scandalous for the end of the 19th century. Next slide. So, well, if you wore all this clothing and you wore it on a particularly hot day, it could be quite uncomfortable, and you could collapse. So here you see an illustration. It is from Queen Victoria's Jubilee, Golden Jubilee in 1887, 50 years on the throne. And you see women fainting, and they're all in the clothing. And so there is this problem of women being constrained by the clothing, and some fainting, and what some people might refer to as hysteria. Next slide. And so here you see a photograph of a scientist, Jean-Marie Charcot, who is giving a lecture on female hysteria in France. And so one of the things is they're trying to understand, why women faint, why women appear to be the weaker sex, why women appear to be sort of more emotional than other. And, the experts are sort of weighing in, and they're all male experts. Next slide. But you see, like, women wanted to actually do things, and much more than sort of engage in the cult of domesticity. They might want to, for example, play tennis. And here you see an advertisement for tennis clothing. We certainly wouldn't be playing tennis in that outfit today, but you can kind of see, like, women might have some different roles, might want to participate in some entertainments. And so the clothing needs to change. Next slide. This one I just think is just absurd. It's ridiculous because it is also tennis clothing, but now what you have is the bustle with the sort of large behind is in this picture. Can you imagine playing tennis in that? Next slide. Archery was all the rage with women at the turn of the 20th century. And here you see a photograph of London of women engaged in archery around 1900. I mean, they are in their full dress corsets, wearing hats. Some might even have some gloves on. Next slide. Well, one of the great products of the second industrial revolution is the bicycle. You get the bicycle, and you also get tires, and it really sort of changes lots of people's motor transportation and also entertainment and sporting. And so here you see a woman on a bike, and she's being helped by another. But this has got to be kind of uncomfortable because she has this dress where you're pretty much sure that this dress is going to get caught in her chain. Next slide. And so if you're going to go on a bicycle, the whole large skirt, corset, hat are probably not going to work so well. And so in some ways, it's leisure and sports that sort of drive some women to rebel. And here you see a bunch of women, and they're not wearing long dresses anymore. In fact, probably some of them are wearing what we call bloomers. Next slide. So the fashion had to change as women began to engage in sports and just sort of everyday kind of biking. And that's what you see in this image right here, where the woman is wearing these bloomers, these pants that kind of go up to the knees. Next slide. But the manufacturers, the advertisers weren't willing to give up the corset just yet. So now here they're designing a corset specially designed for riding a bicycle. Next slide. But, by the time we get to the turn of the 20th century and women participating in sports, a lot of the clothing is not going to work. And so here is, I think this is a stunning photograph of a woman on a beach. She is not wearing much clothing at all, but she probably can swim better than if she were wearing a lot more clothing. Next slide. And so all of a sudden, women's fashions, women's bodies, and women's ideas begin to change. And here you see an illustration of a woman wearing bloomers. She has a freedom of movement. Next slide. So the idea of bloomers had been around since the mid-19th century, at least. Women wanted to, just basically be able to move a little bit more. By the end of the 19th century, they're in full rebellion. This is actually sheet music for a song called I Want to Be a Bloomer. There's a lot of different songs that come out sort of referencing the bloomer. And so the bloomer becomes kind of a cultural icon in the 19th century. But for me, sort of these bloomers become symbolic of the massive political and social changes that are taking place in the West. And all of this kind of gets summed up in something we call, or they called, the woman question. So the woman question was a public debate that happened about women's roles in society. In some ways, they focus on the political sphere. So in the course of the 19th century, in the Western world, most men will get the right to vote. The beginning of the 19th century, you pretty much had to be a man who owned substantial property to participate equally in the franchise. With industrialization at the end of the 19th century in the Western world, a lot of the election laws get changed so that most men, as I said, could vote. But as they extended the vote to the franchise to men, they weren't so keen on extending it to women as well. So lots of women asked, part of the women question, why can't women vote? Socially, there are also significant changes. Women are entering the public sphere, and they're entering it without a chaperone in a significant way by the end of the 19th century. And part of this has to do with the sporting movement. The first modern Olympics occurs in 1896 in Athens. 4 years later, the Olympics take place in Paris, and for the first time, women participate. And so these, it's not only their participation and showing their strong bodies and changing the fashion, but also it is the press coverage of these women sort of putting forth a new feminine ideal. But it's not only in sports where women are changing sort of the discussion socially. Women are occupying lots of spaces in the public sphere. They continue to be workers, okay? So if you're from the working classes, women worked, and that didn't change at all. But at the end of the 19th century, there are new employments that I'll talk about that sort of change women's roles in labor. Women are also very active in charity and philanthropic work in the 19th century, and then they're engaged in leisure activities. We've talked about shopping, we've talked about sports, but also dance halls really take off at the end of the 19th century, and women like to go there, particularly single working women who have a little cash in their pocket like to go to dance halls. The theater takes off, and eventually by the 20th century we get to the cinema. So next slide. Okay, so here you see a photograph of a female worker. She's a weaver at a Lancashire cotton mill in Britain about 1890. So, one of the points is that women have been and continue to work in the factories in the Industrial Revolution. Next slide. So they started in textiles, definitely textile manufacturing, 19th century, and even the 20th century is dominated by female labor. But by the end of the 20th century, as we sort of get these new goods, women are producing the new goods, particularly consumer goods. So here you see women working at the chocolate Cadbury factory in Britain. And so women continue to work, and they work in large numbers, and they're working in factories. Next slide. Certainly one of the professions that sees a major expansion in terms of women participating in the 19th century is nursing. So here you see a nurse at the Prince of Wales Hospital in 1870. And then here, the next slide. Here you see Florence Nightingale with a graduating class at St. Thomas in Buckinghamshire. And so one of the things that happens with nurses at the end of the 19th century is it becomes professionalized. And as it becomes professionalized, women join the nursing profession in significant numbers. Next slide. And so here you see them at the Park Hospital in London around 1908. Next slide. Another profession that undergoes a significant gender change in the course of the 19th century is teaching. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was mostly boys who got educated, and their teachers were also male. But as you have the expansion of education with compulsory public education in the Western world in the course of the 19th century, there is a growing need for teachers. And by mid-century, in most Western countries, it's not only boys who are being educated, it is also girls who are being educated. And so women become teachers in large numbers. Next slide. And as they do this, the teaching profession also becomes professionalized. So common standards set, curriculum for educating teacher is set so that by the turn of the 20th century, in terms of primary schools, women teachers are outnumbering male teachers by significant numbers in the Western world. I would be remiss not to mention, however, that you couldn't be a teacher and be married. So women who decided, once they got married, they had to give up the teaching profession. Next slide. Another area of work that women entered by the end of the 19th century in large numbers was clerical work. So clerical work really took off at the end of the 19th century, and women fulfilled many of those roles. A lot of it involved typing, and a lot of people sort of believe, well, women were great piano players, and so that would naturally translate into typing as well. So it's supposed to be a natural job for women. Next slide. And with that, also in sort of the clerical field became telephone operators. As the telephone took off in the beginning of the 20th century, women were the bulk of the operators with the telephones. Next slide. Well, this slide is a firewomen, a picture of firewomen in Britain around the turn of the 20th century, and they're operating the fire brigade. While this is a common profession, I do think it's important to point out that women are holding lots of professions, but here they are. You know, looks like they're preparing their truck for something, and they are in full corset, full dress, and hats. Next slide. Well, some people wondered about women in these new professions, and this is a satirical cartoon called The Employment of Women. And what you have is these women are supposed to be clerks, and their boss has been out for a while. Now he comes back through the door and he sees these women, and he's outraged because they don't seem to be working. And so this is sort of criticism of women in the labor force. Next slide. So in the Cult of Domesticity, it actually extended to middle-class women performing philanthropic functions. And so many people believe sort of a natural progression of women in this role is they would do charity work. And here's what you see. That's what you see right here is a middle-class woman. She, her husband appears to own some kind of business and has these cottages where his workers live. And the wife now is going to going to this cottage, visiting this elderly woman, and this is a Christmas visit, bringing Christmas gifts. Next slide. A lot of the charity work that these middle-class women did, however, sort of involved charity social functions, and that's what you see here in Munich in 1890, where they're involved in raising funds for the poor. Next slide. But basically what happens at the end of the 19th century is you make a transition from middle-class women as charity workers doing philanthropic work to the birth of a welfare system. And when you begin to have the first parts of welfare and charity work, a lot of people believe that women were natural mothers, and therefore women should be sort of welfare workers. So when we get to the 20th century and we see the expansion of welfare in the Western world, there is a reason why the overwhelming majority of workers in that field tend to be female. It goes back to this long history of the cult of domesticity and women's sort of natural gifts, as some people believed. Next slide. So women entered the public sphere in other ways, and certainly the new leisure, such as the dance hall here. Here's the Moulin Rouge. Women go out, and here you see them. I love this. This is like, you know, the beginning of the 20th century, and they seem very independent. They seem to be out with their girlfriends and not necessarily with a man. Next slide. And here you see them out at the St. James Theatre in Britain. Next slide. And so we get a phenomenon by the end of the 19th century called the New Woman. the new woman who doesn't look like her mother, who is living the cult of domesticity. This is a new woman. She is urban. She is from the middle classes. She is educated. She has a career, and hopefully she has some financial independence. So we see this rebellion against sort of the old notion of femininity. And here you see this illustration, a woman, she's smoking a cigarette in a railway car sitting next to a man. I always think of the Virginia Slim ads for the Virginia Slim cigarettes. Something like, you come a long way, baby. So emancipation becomes the ability to smoke a cigarette. The Virginia Slim was fantastic at marketing that. Next slide. So this quotation here kind of sums up the new woman's perspective. Who has been given the exercise of civil responsibilities? Men. Who has been assured the rights of property? Men. Who has been given the right and privileges of paternity? Men. For whom has liberty and equality been established? Again, men. In sum, everything is by them or for them. It is therefore for them also, and for them alone, that political society has been made. Women have no part in it. So women's resistance, these rebels, not only took place in the social sphere, in the leisure sphere, in the home, it also extended to the political sphere, and it is summed up with the move for the right to vote, suffrage. Next slide. And so we begin to see the origins of the feminist movement at the end of the 19th century. I just, like, what is a definition of feminism? I always see it as something as simple as women just asking for equal rights. In what areas did they want equal rights? Well, how about marriage? Marriage and divorce laws, rights over their children and custody laws, property rights, the ability to sort of own property, to take out loans and so on and so forth. Education, the ability to be educated equally towards men. The suffrage movement at the end of the 19th century also took up a number of social issues, which included the trafficking of women. There was a lot of slave trafficking going on, and then temperance, and that was very popular in the US as well. Next slide. So the key demand for many of these feminists was suffrage. It was the right to vote, and this was particularly true in the United States and Britain, where they had active suffrage movements. In this picture here, you have a suffragette basically asking John Bull. John Bull is like the Uncle Sam of Britain. She's asking, won't you let me help? Or won't you let me help you, John? And so the idea for a lot of women who wanted the right to vote is that they're going to work through the parliamentary system. Next slide. And that's what you see in this photograph here of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies office in Britain. So I like it because it says Oldham's Women's Suffrage Society, non-party, non-militant. And the organization's leader, Millicent Garrett Fawcett, the most famous of the British suffragists, had this to say: I advocate the extension of the franchise to women because I wish to strengthen true womanliness in women, and because I want to see the womanly and domestic side of things weigh more and count for more in all public concerns. And so basically what she's saying is she wants women to enter the public sphere, enter the political sphere legally in order to emphasize their feminine qualities. Next slide. But the feminists in Britain had a problem because they thought that the politicians at the time when it was to vote, oh, well, then they would be, welcoming women. Women did get the right to vote in some local elections in 1870 in Britain. But did the politicians support suffrage? Oh, no. And that's what you see on the right hand. They're having the police take the suffragists away. Next slide. And so some women disagreed with this idea of working through the system to get suffrage. They didn't think it was ever going to work. And that was certainly Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters. Emmeline had this to say: men got the vote because they were and would be violent. The women did not get it because they were constitutional and law abiding. So they are the head of the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, and they are advocating a different route to emancipation. Next slide. And so they have mass demonstrations. Okay, one of the largest occurred in 1907 with 3,000 women joining in London. Then 1908, they had even a larger one with about 300,000 demonstrators. Next slide. So the thing about the WSPU is they were much more radical than many of the mainstream feminist organizations. And so they engaged in civil disobedience. Now, civil disobedience was it was a relative phenomenon. What might seem as civil disobedience today would look very different than what it did back then. And so their civil disobedience included things like heckling politicians when they were talking or disrupting a meeting. They could go to get more radical, like chaining themselves to the gates of Parliament. They definitely destroyed property. One of the things that they were known for was going into museums and destroying works of art. They eventually became violent, engaged in arson campaigns and blowing up post boxes. And so what they did is they get a whole bunch of civil disobedient activities, and large of it was just simply publicity stunts. What they wanted to do was draw attention to their cause of the right to vote. Next slide. So these women, they were arrested because they broke the law. And in 1905, there's a general election in 1905 in Britain. Actually, it's in 1906, but the campaigning starts in 1905. And these women engage in a host of civil disobedience acts that lead them to be arrested. And so one very famous meeting, which was attended by Winston Churchill, but it was in sponsorship of Sir Edward Grey, who was the Foreign Secretary. He has this meeting in October, and a couple of the suffragists go there and they shout, "Will the Liberal government get votes to women?" And they unfurl a banner that says "Votes for Women," and they are arrested and thrown in jail. And this radicalizes the movements, as Emmeline Pankhurst describes here in this quotation. "This was the beginning of a campaign, the like of which was never known in England, or for that matter in any other country. We interrupted a great many meetings as well. We were we were violently thrown out and insulted. Often we were painfully bruised and hurt." Next slide. And so what you have is a whole host of women being arrested for civil disobedience. Now, I want to underscore that these women are middle-class women for the most part. And so people are very alarmed. I mean, these women are not sort of abiding by dominant notions of femininity, but they don't want them arrested and they don't want them thrown in jail. Next slide. And so here you see another woman getting arrested. And so they go into prisons and they ask to be treated like political prisoners, not like common criminals. But the government refuses. So it treats them like common criminals. And by all accounts, there were incidences of abuses, of like sexual harassment, and some very sort of brutal, violent actions against these women as they were imprisoned. And as a result of this, these women went on hunger strikes. They went on hunger strikes to be recognized as political prisoners and not common criminals. Next slide. And so all of a sudden now you have middle-class women in prison and they're on hunger strikes and they're beginning to die. And as a result of that, the government relies on something we call force feeding, basically pushing a tube down the women's nose and giving them food. Over 1,000 women were force fed. One woman, Charlotte Marsh, she was force fed 139 times. And next slide. One woman, Mary Lee, who was arrested many times, she was force fed, and she describes it like this. "On Saturday afternoon, the wardens forced me onto the bed and 2 doctors came in. While I was held down, a nasal tube was inserted. It is 2 yards long with a funnel at the end. There is a glass junction in the middle to see if the liquid is passing. The end is put up the right and the left nostril on alternative days. The sensation is most painful. The drums of the ears seem to be bursting, and there is a horrible pain in the throat and the breast. The tube is pushed down 20 inches. I am on the bed, pinned down by the wardesses. One doctor holds the funnel end, and the other doctor forces the other end up the nostrils. The one holding the funnel ends pours the liquid down, about a pint of milk, egg and milk is sometimes used. So lots of women, describe this as a very violent procedure against them. They liken it to rape. Next slide. And so the public is outraged. They just can't imagine middle-class women in prison being, tied down with sort of, this very violent food being forced down to their down into their body. And so as a result of it, a law is passed nicknamed the Cat and Mouse Act from 1913 that basically allowed for women who were on the verge of death to be released from prison. The part of the law was once they regained their strength, they were imprisoned again. And so things are really heating up in Britain. Next slide. And it all culminates in June 1913. There is the running of the Epsom Derby, okay? And one of the suffragists, Emily Davison, she basically goes in front of the king's horse and she is trampled to death. Next slide. She dies 4 days later and there was a huge funeral for her. The Queen at the time, the British Queen at the time, described her in a letter to the jockey who was riding the horse this way: the abominable behavior of a brutal lunatic woman. So obviously the Queen was not a fan of the suffragists. And she's not the only one. Next slide. So here is a passage from the Concord brothers. They were French brothers. This is what they wrote in 1857 about these women wanting the right to vote. They said this: "Men like ourselves need a woman of little breeding and education, who is nothing but gaiety and natural wit, because a woman of that sort can charm and please us like an agreeable animal to which we may become quite attached. But if a mistress has acquired a veneer of breeding, art, or literature, and tries to talk to us on an equal footing about our thoughts and our feeling for beauty, if she wants to be a companion and a partner in the cultivation of our tastes or the writing of our books, then she becomes for us as unbearable as a piano out of tune, and very soon an object of dislike." So what do we have here? On the one hand, we have quite a few women rebelling against the cult of domesticity, the wearing of the corset, the lack of rights, and being pretty successful with the growing suffrage movement. On the other hand, we have others who want to sort of retain the gender order with women placed in that cult of domesticity. And here we are at the beginning of the 20th century. Things are heating up, and it's not really sure how everything is going to go in terms of the women's right to vote. Next slide. And then August 1914, World War I starts. And when World War I starts, women basically put their demands for the right to vote on hold, and they enlist in the campaign for their country to win the war. So even the suffragists get caught up in the wave of enthusiasm for World War I, and they put their political demands on the back burner. Even the Pankhursts begin to work for the war effort and during this citizens' peace. For those of you who sat in my World War I lectures, you know that women went to work in large numbers. And so when they come out of the war, life is very different. Next slide. And one of the results of World War I is that in many countries, women get the right to vote. It's kind of hard to sort of say women shouldn't have the right to vote when they really roll up their sleeves for the war effort. So it's not a coincidence that particularly, at the tail end of the war and right after the war, many countries in the West give women the right to vote. So 1915, Denmark and Iceland. 1917, the Netherlands and the Soviet Union. 1980, big year, 1918. Sweden, Great Britain, Germany, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. 1919, Luxembourg. 1920, US, Canada, Belgium. 1922, Ireland, which is now has just gained its independence. So we see this wave of the right for women to vote in the Western world right after World War I, which in part has to do with the groundwork that the suffragists laid. But on the other hand, it also has more to do with the war sacrifice that these women made. Can you go back to the slide? I just want to point out that some countries had to wait quite a bit till after World War II, 1945, France, Italy, 46, Yugoslavia, Romania, and 47, Bulgaria. The loser in the European countries is Switzerland, has to wait for 1970 until women get full rights to vote. So I guess that concludes this series of lectures on the cult of domesticity, from cultivating it to rebelling against it. I sure hope you have enjoyed it. I certainly have enjoyed being with you. I know that these are really difficult times, and I hope sort of bring you sort of a little bit of a distraction, a little bit of comfort, and I wish you well, and I hope you take very good care of yourself. Thank you for participating.